Money is a servant, never a master, commanded with purpose, or it will command you with pride. That one truth, if it possessed our hearts, would settle much of the unrest in our modern Christian lives for far too many. Money has ceased to be a tool and has become a testimony to misplaced trust, to worldly ambition dressed up in religious language, to self-dependence parading as stewardship. We speak of provision, of planning, of saving, but what we often mean is hoarding, fearing and building little fortresses against the uncertainty of a world that no longer trusts in the sovereignty of God. It is not money that ruins men, it is the place it occupies in their affections. Money does not whisper lies until it is given a throne. Once seated there, it becomes a cruel tyrant. It will shape your prayers, bend your convictions, and distort your vision. The man who begins by using money will end up being used by it, unless he learns early that it is to be governed by a higher authority. We do not ask money what is possible, we ask God what is required. Then money, if it will not obey, must be dismissed from the conversation altogether. The soul must decide whether it wants God to be the provider or whether it wants to become its own source. The moment that decision is made in favor of the self, money becomes the false god with 1,000 voices. It begins to speak into every decision what we can do, what we should attempt, what we must refuse. And soon the invisible chains are in place. We no longer move by faith but by forecasts. We no longer listen for the whisper of the Spirit. We check the figures, the trends, the bottom line. It is a dreadful trade, intimacy with God, for the illusion of security. The early church had no money, and yet they turned the world upside down. Today, we have money, resources, influence, and we can barely turn a congregation into a community. That should alarm us. That should drive us to our knees. It is not the amount of money that matters, it is whether it flows from obedience or fear, from surrender or from control. There is a kind of stewardship that is nothing more than baptized greed. It sounds prudent. It appears wise, but it is born of mistrust. It does not ask, "What would you have me do?" but rather, "How much can I hold back and still be righteous?" God has never required his people to fund his will. He has only required their trust. Abraham did not calculate the cost of Isaac. He simply obeyed. The widow did not weigh the consequence of giving her last coin. She gave. The disciples did not delay to consider whether 5 loaves and 2 fish were sufficient. They placed it in the hands of Christ, and the Lord took what was offered in faith and multiplied. Always, it is the surrender, not the supply, that draws heaven's attention. This is why money must be treated like a servant. Give it orders, send it out, put it to holy use, but never ask it for advice, never bow to its opinion, never allow it to determine what obedience looks like. The man who lets money define obedience has already compromised. He will do only what the budget permits, and what the budget permits is rarely what faith demands. We are not called to live within the constraints of our means, but within the freedom of our calling. If God calls, then he provides. If he sends, then he supplies. But he does not always supply before the step. He often waits for the step. Faith is not about having everything in place. It is about trusting the one who is always in place. Too many of God's people are waiting to see before they move, and so they never see what God can do with those who move before they see. To command money with purpose is to settle once and for all that it has no voice in your destiny. It has no seat in your counsel. It does not dictate what is worthy, what is possible, or what is wise. Only God has that authority. And when God speaks, money must obey or be cast aside. Do not be afraid to walk away from resources that refuse to follow righteousness. The devil will always offer you funding for a shortcut. The world will always applaud the financially sound compromise. But the man of God walks by a different light. He measures not in dollars but in obedience. He who kneels before God can stand before any economy. That is not poetry, that is survival. We live in a day where fear is traded on the hour. Market crashes, inflation, scarcity, debt ceilings. The world trembles at every fluctuation. But the man who has made peace with heaven does not tremble. His balance sheet is not in the hands of Wall Street, but in the hands of the one who owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. He does not live by crumbs fallen from the tables of economists, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. You show me a man who has spent an hour in the presence of God, and I will show you a man who is not intimidated by the fluctuations of financial systems. The presence of God bestows a clarity that cannot be bought. It gives a posture that does not bend at the sight of lack. The man who has heard the voice of God does not tremble when the voice of fear speaks. He has already bowed once deeply, permanently, and now no other force can make him bow again. This is why prayerlessness leads to poverty, not of resources but of courage. When we do not kneel before God, we begin to rise before men. We start to make our decisions based on appearances, based on statistics, based on human logic, and slowly, subtly, we begin to serve the opinions of men more than the commands of. We become employees of the system instead of sons of the kingdom. God is not impressed by your budget. He is moved by your trust. The greatest transactions of heaven have nothing to do with money. They have everything to do with surrender. Faith, real faith, never calculates the cost in earthly terms. It counts only what is eternal. That is why the saints of old lived such wild lives. They were not irresponsible, they were invincible, because they were dead to the world and alive to Christ. They had seen a city not built with hands. They had heard a voice not printed in ink. They had been pierced by a call that no earthly security could match. We live in an hour where much is said about money, even in the church. Strategies, principles, plans, appeal. But God is still asking a very old question: whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And the answer he seeks is not a budget proposal, it is a willing heart. Heaven never once asked, how much do you have? It only asks, how much do you trust? You can be broke and still be rich in faith. You can be surrounded by lack and still be full of vision. And you can have all the money in the world and be absolutely bankrupt in the eyes of God. Money follows obedience, not the other way around. And when it does not, it becomes a weight rather than a tool. Too many are waiting for the provision before they obey the command. But that is not how the kingdom works. The Red Sea did not part until the people moved forward. The manna did not fall until the wilderness had been entered. The oil did not multiply until the last drop had been poured out. God waits for the motion of faith before he sends the floodgates of provision. This is not manipulation, it is sanctification. He is training his people to trust, not just to trend. The man who kneels before God understands this instinctively. He does not try to outplan God. He does not draft alternatives in case God fails. He has settled once and for all that obedience is its own reward, and that God is no debtor. If he commands, he will complete. If he calls, he will equip. And if he sends, he will fund. But the kneeling comes first. So the question is not whether God will provide. That question is already answered by his name, Jehovah Jireh. The real question is, will we bow? Will we act on the whisper of his voice, even when the numbers don't align, even when the path looks barren, even when every earthly advisor would caution delay? The currency of heaven is not minted in gold or printed in paper. It is measured in trust, obedience, and surrender. He who walks in that currency lacks nothing. He who walks without it, though his bank accounts be full, is already poor. Provision flows not to the clever, but to the consecrated. This generation has come to believe that strategy is more sacred than surrender, that ingenuity is equal to anointing, and that charisma can stand in place of consecration. We have turned the holy into the helpful, the divine into the pragmatic, and the sacred into the merely successful. But God does not pour out provision upon those who outthink the world. He blesses those who have been broken before him, who have died to ambition and pride, and who now live with a burning desire to please him alone. The clever man builds systems, makes connections, multiplies efforts, and leans on technique. But the consecrated man burns. He may not be efficient, but he is holy. He may not be impressive, but he is pure. And God looks for such men whose hearts are altars, whose words carry weight, not because they are sharp, but because they are surrendered. God does not advance his kingdom through calculated brilliance. He advances it through crucified vessels. Cleverness may move men, but only consecration moves heaven. There are churches full of men who know how to organize, but not how to agonize. They are skilled, but not surrendered. They are polished, but not pierced. The Spirit does not fall because the spreadsheet is balanced. He falls when the soul is emptied of self. And yet we persist in believing that if we can simply get smarter, sharper, more advanced, then the fire will fall. No, The fire never falls on unbroken altar. The Lord does not respond to intelligence. He responds to incense, the incense of a life laid down. When God chose a man to lead his people out of Egypt, he did not choose a strategist. He chose a man who had been crushed for 40 years in the wilderness. Moses had been clever once, full of zeal and strength and personal ambition. But that Moses had to die. The man God used was the one who stammered, who felt unworthy, who knew that unless God moved, nothing would move. That is the man who can carry provision because he knows he cannot generate it. The consecrated man walks in the confidence of God, not in the competence of flesh. The danger with cleverness is that it masks our dependence. It makes us feel that we have some measure of control over the outcome. But the kingdom does not yield to the clever. It yields to the crucified. The power of Pentecost did not come to the planners. It came to those who waited, who tarried, who lingered in prayer with no plan except to obey. God is not looking for your best ideas. He is looking for your deepest surrender. Provision follows consecration because consecration makes room for God to act. The clever man fills every space with his own wisdom. He leaves no room for the unexpected. But the consecrated man walks slowly, waits patiently, and listens carefully. He is not in a rush because he knows the voice of the Lord cannot be rushed. He is not afraid to lack because he knows his provider is never late. And when the world looks at him and sees foolishness, heaven sees a vessel ready to carry glory. The provision of God is holy. It does not fall into the hands of those who would use it for their own elevation. It does not rest upon ministries built on ego. It comes where the ground has been cleared, where ambition has been crucified, and where only the purposes of God remain. And until that consecration happens, the provision may delay, not because God withholds, but because we are not yet ready to receive. And this is where the next truth strikes deeper still. Faith is not a lever to move wealth. It is a fire that consumes the need for it. We have made faith a tool, a formula, a means of acquiring what we desire. But true faith does not increase our appetite. It purifies. Faith is not the belief that God will fund our plans. It is the surrender that allows him to burn away everything that is not his will. Real faith is not additive. It is subtractive. It does not accumulate. It reduces us to the essentials of obedience and trust. Many seek faith because they want results. They want increase, overflow, blessing. But faith is not about securing outcomes. It is about securing intimacy with the one who speaks and never lies. Faith does not manipulate heaven, it yields to heaven. The man of faith is not trying to get God to do something. He is trying to hear what God is already doing and align himself with it. If there is a fire in his bones, it is not for success, but for obedience. If he cries out, it is not for gain, but for holiness. Faith, when it is real, begins to strip us of our demands. It does not encourage us to ask for more. It causes us to wonder whether we truly need anything at all except Christ. This is why those with the deepest faith often live with the fewest possessions, not because God has failed to bless them, but because they have come to a place where blessing is no longer defined by material things. They are full, even when their hands are empty. They are rich, even when their bank accounts say otherwise, because the fire of faith has burned away every lesser need and left only this. Thy will be done. We must learn to beware of the faith that insists, the faith that demands, the faith that names and claims and forces its way into heaven's storehouse. That is not faith. It is presumption baptized in religious language. True faith never speaks louder than the voice of God. It never pushes past the peace of the Spirit. It waits, it yields, it worships even when it has nothing. And in that posture it receives everything. The fire of faith is not for comfort. It is for consecration. It burns away the self. It burns away the fear. It burns away the impatience that demands answers now. It leaves us with the treasure that cannot be touched by moth or rust or That is the faith of Abraham, who waited, hoping against hope. That is the faith of Daniel, who faced lions with calm resolve. That is the faith of Paul, who called his afflictions light and momentary, while chained in prison. This kind of faith is not fragile, it is forward, and it does not waver when provision seems far. It knows that God himself is the provision. We must ask ourselves, what is it we truly want from God? If we had all the wealth in the world, but not him, would we be satisfied? If he gave us every resource but withheld his voice, would we still call it a blessing? The man of faith has already answered those questions. He does not measure wealth in coin or cash or comfort. He measures it in nearness to the Holy. He knows that if he has God, he lacks nothing, even when everything seems absent. That is the miracle of the fire. It does not simply light the way, it consumes every other light. Faith is not the means by which we get our way. It is the means by which we die to our way. It crucifies us. It disorients us. It humbles us until we are small enough to fit within the will of God. And only then, only when we have ceased to strive, do we begin to see that what we thought we needed was never the point. He was the point. His presence, His approval, His purpose. This is why the world will never understand the truly faithful. They do not fight for position. They do not chase promotion. They do not panic when things fall apart, because their lives are not built on systems, but on surrender. They are not waiting for the provision to begin walking. They are walking because they already trust the provider. Their faith is not in what God might give. Their faith is in who God is. That is enough for them. Provision may come. It may not. The circumstances may change. The doors may open, or they may remain shut. But the man who has been purified by the fire of faith no longer builds his peace upon outcomes. He builds it upon the unchanging character of God. And that peace is not shaken by delay, nor stolen by lack. It is rooted in eternity, anchored beyond the veil. And so we return to the beginning. Provision flows not to the clever, but to the consecrated. And faith is not a lever to move wealth. It is a fire that consumes the need for it. Let the soul weigh it. Let it sit under the weight of these truths until the cleverness dies and the fire falls, not for gain, but for God, not for success, but for surrender. God funds what He authors. Stop asking for what He hasn't written. It is a hard thing to accept in a generation that believes anything can be achieved with enough passion, enough planning, and enough persistence. But heaven does not co-sign every ambition, no matter how noble it may sound. The church must return to the terrifying clarity of divine authorship. What God initiates, He sustains. What God begins, He completes. But He has bound Himself to fund only that which bears His signature. When men step beyond that line, they must fund their visions with the sweat of the flesh, not the oil of the Spirit. The tragedy of our age is that many have confused their desires with God's will. They have mistaken emotional excitement for spiritual authorization. They dream big, they plan thoroughly, they speak with confidence, but they have not yet heard from God. The result is a multitude of projects that began in enthusiasm and end in exhaustion. We speak of burnout, of discouragement, of financial strain, but the root issue is often much simpler. We are asking God to finance what He never commissioned. We are asking heaven to supply resources for a blueprint drafted in human wisdom. The Spirit does not respond to volume. He responds to alignment. It is not how loudly we ask, but how closely we walk. The man who walks in step with God need not beg for provision. He finds that what is necessary arrives in its time, quietly, without struggle. Like manna in the morning. The supply of God is tied to the voice of God. Where He speaks, there He sends. Where He sends, there He provides. But when He is silent, let us tremble before moving. Silence from God is not a delay. It is often a warning. We have made the dangerous assumption that good intentions guarantee divine support, but the flesh is capable of many good things, many moral things, many inspiring things, and still remain untouched by the hand of God. The test of a work is not its appearance, its size, or its impact. It is whether it was authored by the Spirit. If it was, it will be sustained by heaven. If it wasn't, it will eventually become a monument to man's best effort, but not to God's power. The church must learn once again to wait, not for funding, but for fire, not for approval, but for anointing. We have become too quick to act, too eager to launch, too anxious to succeed, and so we bypass the holy furnace where motives are refined and plans are reduced to act. That furnace is the birthplace of true calling. Until a man has let his vision die before God, he cannot know whether it was ever truly alive. We must come to the place where we no longer ask, "How can I make this happen?" but rather, "Did you, Lord, even ask for this?" And if the answer is silence, then let us lay the dream down with trembling hands and empty hearts. If God has authored it, it will live without manipulation. It will be sustained without striving. It will grow without gimmicks. It will bear fruit that remains. But if he has not written it, we will find ourselves building Babels, tall, impressive, and destined for confusion. We must be willing to let the pen fall from our hands and let him write the script. Only then can we ask boldly for provision, knowing that what we ask for is already in his will. The love of money hides best in the language of need and vision. Few deceptions are as subtle as sanctified, and as spiritually camouflaged as the love of money. It rarely enters the church dressed in greed. It comes cloaked in vision, in strategy, in kingdom advance. It speaks not of luxury but of necessity. It does not flaunt itself openly. It hides in boardrooms, budgets, and building campaigns. And all the while it whispers not, "Make me your God," but rather, "You cannot do this without me." That is the great seduction, that money is indispensable, that without it the work must stop, that with more of it the work will finally flourish. Slowly, quietly, the affections of the heart shift. The dependence that once belonged to God alone is now shared with the balance sheet. The prayers once offered in fiery trust now come laced with anxiety, and the boldness that once stood before Goliath now bows before spreadsheets. This is not stewardship, it is idolatry in disguise. We have grown clever in our terminology. We speak of partnerships, of opportunities, of expansion, but underneath it all we must ask ourselves, are we still trusting God, or have we made an unspoken agreement with mammon? The Lord said we could not serve both, yet many today attempt a dangerous compromise, publicly serving Christ while privately leaning on money. And what makes it all the more deceptive is that it's done for the work of the Lord. But God does not need help from a rival God to accomplish his purpose. The need is real, but it is never the compass. The vision may be true, but it is not the master. The church must rediscover what it means to be poor in spirit, not poor in resources, but in self-reliance, for it is only in that poverty that the riches of heaven flow freely. The love of money does not always shout, it whispers. It whispers in meetings, in decisions, in sleepless nights. It whispers when we weigh faith against feasibility, and it always presents itself as wisdom. We must ask God to reveal where we have baptized our dependence on money and called it responsibility, where we have reduced the supernatural to the sustainable, where we have replaced the altar with a ledger. These are hard questions, and few dare ask them, because to ask them might mean shutting down the very things we believe define our ministry. But better to have a small work filled with God's power than a massive enterprise filled with anxiety, performance, and hidden compromise. The spirit is grieved not only by sin but by substitution. When we look to money for what only God can give, peace, validation, security, we commit a quiet betrayal. And though the outside may continue to thrive, the inside begins to decay. The anointing lifts, the power fades, the words grow hollow, and all the while we keep building, we keep fundraising, we keep calling it vision. God is not against money, he is against mixture. He is against divided trust, against double-mindedness, against hearts that say one thing and depend on another. If we are to walk in purity, we must walk in simplicity. And if we are to walk in simplicity, we must walk away from the hidden entanglements of financial idolatry. That path is narrow, that path is costly, but it is the only path where the fire falls. Speak not to money, but to the mission. Money overhears and obeys. The man of God must learn early that his authority is not in his wallet, nor in his connections, nor in his strategies, but in the word that burns within him. When the mission is born of God, it carries its own provision. The man who is possessed by the call does not chase after means. He proclaims the message and the means follow. The danger lies in shifting the conversation. When a man begins to speak more to money than to the mission itself, he betrays the root of his trust. His prayers shift tune, his speech shifts focus. His labor becomes toil, not obedience. There is something sacred about a man who walks in purpose, undistracted by the lack around him. He builds because he has been told to build. He speaks because he has been told to speak. He does not wait for financial signs to confirm divine orders. He does not measure spiritual instruction by economic possibility. He simply moves, and heaven moves with him. Provision becomes a shadow of obedience. It follows, but it never leads. Money is a terrible master, but a willing servant. When the mission is clear and the man is clean before God, money becomes obedient. It arrives in strange ways through unexpected channels. Because it is not being summoned, it is being summoned by the hand of God who sees the obedience of his servant. The true man of faith does not manipulate the supply, he magnifies the sender. His mission is not a brand to promote or a product to sell. It is a burden to carry, a fire to bear, a word to release. The church must be reminded that the mission is not funded because of our eloquence in appeal or our brilliance in campaign. It is funded because God is faithful to what he has commanded. When Elijah stood on Mount Carmel, he did not bring water, he brought faith. He spoke not to resources, but to the God who controls the fire, and the fire fell, not because of strategy, but because of surrender. The same pattern holds today, where God finds a man emptied of self, filled with the word and obedient to the whisper, the fire still falls. And where the fire falls, provision follows. There are those who have mastered the language of resource but forgotten the language of reverence. They speak constantly of goals, of numbers, of reach, but they no longer speak of holiness, brokenness, and the secret place. The mission has become a mechanism, not a mandate. It has become something to manage rather than something to die for. And when the mission loses its divine edge, money must be chased, cajoled, and captured, because it no longer hears anything worth obeying. The mission of God has never needed the endorsement of gold. It needs the obedience of the one called to carry it. And when a man or a church begins to live with a holy indifference toward resources and a holy obsession with righteousness, money comes without corruption. It hears the echo of heaven in the voice of the sent one. It senses the weight of glory, and it cannot resist. But speak first to the mission. Speak it with tears. Speak it with purity. Speak it with courage. And money, like a servant trained to listen, will take its place. The sentence that makes money move is the one that heaven echoes. Not every word spoken in faith is repeated in heaven. There are many bold statements, many confident declarations, many grand visions, but unless they are first heard and echoed by the throne, they have no power to move anything beyond human effort. The spiritual realm does not respond to volume, it responds to agreement. It listens not for drama but for alignment. It waits for the sentence that was born in the heart of God and spoken through the lips of a consecrated vessel. There is a sacred weight to words that originate in the presence of God. When a man emerges from prayer and speaks, not to impress but to obey, the sentence carries a force beyond human persuasion. That word moves hearts, opens doors, unlocks provision, and disturbs darkness. Not because of the man, but because the sentence did not begin with him. It began with God. Heaven echoes it. The Spirit confirms it, and the resources of earth begin to respond. It is not enough to be sincere. It is not enough to be passionate. The sentence must be born in the flame. It must be soaked in tears. It must pass through the fire of testing, the crushing of pride, the silence of waiting. And when it finally rises, refined and unshaken, it carries the sound of heaven. That sound is unmistakable. Hell fears it. Angels recognize it. The earth makes room for it. Money responds not to need alone, but to the voice of heaven embedded in the words of the sent one. When the early church spoke, it shook cities. Not because they had perfected presentation, but because they had touched the glory. They did not ask for donations. They declared the kingdom. They did not chase after patrons. They preached with power. And God added to their number daily. The sound of heaven was upon them, and everything else followed. We must tremble again at the responsibility of speech. Too many have used holy words to build earthly kingdom. Too many have spoken presumptuously and expected heaven to agree. But heaven does not echo ambition. It echoes obedience. It does not endorse the self-assigned. It empowers the God-appointed. The sentence that moves the world is the one first whispered in the chambers of heaven. The modern church must be reminded that not all movement is from God. Not all provision is a sign of His pleasure. The question is not did it work, but did He. The temptation to craft words that impress people will always compete with the call to wait for the word that moves heaven. But the man who waits, who listens, who trembles before he speaks, his voice may be rare, but it is filled with authority. His words may be few, but they are heavy with heaven. Let us then seek not clever phrasing or captivating vision statements, but the echo. Let us wait until we know the Spirit has spoken. Let us be silent until the fire burns. And when the sentence is finally formed in the depths of our spirit, we speak it once with faith, with clarity, with purity, and the created world begins to realign. Provision flows, doors open, hearts soften. Not because we said it, but because He said it through us. That is the power of the echoed sentence. That is the mystery of divine speech. And that is the only kind of sentence worth speaking. Money rushes to our surrender, is total, and motives are clean. The Lord is not watching for enterprise. He is watching for emptiness, that holy vacancy in the soul which has ceased from striving, has surrendered every agenda, and has placed all in His hands without condition. There is a kind of purity that attracts provision, not because the soul is worthy, but because it is empty enough for God to fill. Heaven does not resist the surrendered, it leans in toward them. The man who has laid down his right to be understood, his desire to be applauded, and his plan to be recognized, is the man whom God can trust with His treasure. It is not the sharp that draw the resources of the kingdom, but the pure. The Lord has no interest in funding human egos. He does not finance ambition. He does not pour out upon those who secretly want to be seen, who use the language of vision to cloak the lust for influence. There must be a searching of the heart, a ruthless honesty in the hidden place, where motives are exposed and sanctified. God will not release what He must later judge. He waits for clean hands and a pure heart, not perfect, but purified. Too many ministries and lives are built on subtle bargains with God. They say the right things, quote the right verses, but underneath is the quiet hope that if they do enough, give enough, serve enough, then the blessing will come. But God cannot be negotiated with. He cannot be bought. He moves where there is nothing left to trade, where the man or woman has died to the need to earn, impress, or perform. In that empty, surrendered vessel, He deposits what is needed, not merely to sustain the mission, but to glorify Himself. Money does not resist the will of God. It only hesitates where the will of man is still alive. Where surrender is incomplete, provision is delayed, not as punishment but as mercy. God will not let us be ruined by answered prayers that would have served our pride. He waits until the soul no longer burns for outcomes, but only for obedience. And when He finds that place quiet, clean, laid down, He sends what is needed, quickly, without struggle, because there is no longer a danger that the gift will steal the heart from the giver. The provision of God is precise. It does not arrive too early, nor too late, but it does not come where there is confusion of motive. If a man asks with selfish intent or even noble intent clouded by self-promotion, the heavens wait. But when the intent is sanctified and the posture is low, the resources move swiftly. For now there is a vessel that will not rob God of glory. This is why some seem to walk under an open heaven, not because they are more talented, but because they are more surrendered. They do not touch the gold for themselves. They carry it where He tells them. They use it only to build what He has commanded. Heaven's economy runs on purity, not pressure, and it favors those who ask for nothing but His will. There is no shortage of funds in the kingdom. There is only a shortage of yielded hearts who will not turn the blessing into an idol. God cannot deposit His glory into hands that are still grasping, but to the open hand, the surrendered will, the crucified ambition there, He entrusts what He must guard elsewhere. Say only what eternity can cash, and earth will pay attention. The world is filled with voices, many speaking loud, few speaking true. But the voice that has been refined in the fires of the secret place, that has been taught by the silence of God, that has learned to weep before it learned to speak, that voice carries eternal weight. When it speaks, the earth listens, not because it shouts, but because it rings with the sound of another world. There are too many words spoken in the name of God that have no echo in eternity. They may move crowds, but they do not move angels. They may raise money, but they do not raise the dead. They are eloquent, but empty. And the reason is simple. They were never born in the place where eternity speaks. They were crafted by intellect, not received by revelation. They were polished for effect, not pressed out through prayer. But the voice that waits until eternity speaks, that voice has authority. It does not need to persuade. It simply declares, and the creation recognizes the sound of its creator. We must return to the discipline of eternal speech. The words we speak must be weighed by more than their popularity. They must be measured by their permanence. Can what we say be carried into the throne room without burning up in the fire of His holiness? Can it survive the scrutiny of angels? Can it be repeated in heaven without correction? If not, then let it remain unsaid, for only that which is born in eternity can bear fruit in time. The church has become too familiar with casual speech about holy things. We say much, we declare quickly, we promise broadly. But the kingdom does not run on slogans, it runs on substance, and substance comes not from wit or wisdom, but from weight. The man who has learned to be quiet until God speaks will be feared by hell and trusted by heaven. When he opens his mouth, what he says matters, because it was not his idea, it came from the eternal. Let us remember that the world is not changed by noise, it is changed by truth. And truth is not found in abundance of words, but in the presence of God. There, in that place where the flesh is silenced and the soul is still, the eternal speaks. And when it speaks, the man who hears it becomes dangerous to the darkness. His words are not his own. They are weapons forged in the furnace of divine intimacy. Say only what eternity can cash. Speak only what has been first spoken in heaven. Do not rush to declare, to promote, to announce. Wait, listen, tremble. And then if the word comes, speak it softly, if necessary, but with the force of the throne behind it. Earth will take notice. The powers that be will pause. Resources will realign, because eternity has spoken, and the world must respond. And so we come to the end of this matter, not merely in words, but in spirit. We have said much, but the weight of it cannot be measured by volume. It must be weighed in the inner chamber where all things are made clear by the light of His presence. For what is the worth of a message if it does not first cut through the speaker's own soul? And what is the use of truth if it is not first lived, then spoken? In every generation, God seeks a voice, not a noise, not a trend, not a technique, but a voice born of fire and silence, shaped by surrender and solitude. That voice does not echo the marketplace, it echoes the throne. And where that voice is heard, things change. Provision comes, doors open, powers shift. But not because the voice is powerful in itself. It is powerful only because it has ceased to belong to the man. It has become the property of God. This whole journey from the first sentence to the last has not been about money. It has never been about supply, wealth, budgets, or resources. These are merely the shadows, the reflections of a deeper truth. The real subject has always been surrender. The real issue has always been trust. For money is not a source, it is a servant. It does not initiate, it follows. It does not lead, it responds. And it responds most immediately, most fully, and most obediently. Where God's will is unopposed and God's glory is unchallenged in the heart of a man. We do not need more Christian entrepreneurs, we need more crucified visionaries. We do not need more strategy, we need more sanctuaries. Sacred places in the soul where God speaks and we wait, where the word is not used but obeyed. The church must learn again to live with its face to the ground, to walk barefoot on holy ground, to tremble before it dares to plant. We must recover the fear of the Lord, not terror, but awe, not panic, but purity. For where that fear is restored, the voice of the Lord is heard again. And where His voice is heard, the provision of heaven is never far behind. The man who makes money respond is not the man who speaks with persuasive authority. He is the man who has stopped speaking altogether until God speaks through him. He does not stir emotion, he stirs eternity. His prayers are not long, but they are full of faith, full of death to self, full of that strange and sacred boldness that only the Spirit can give. He does not merely ask, he declares. But his declarations are not his own. They are echoes of a greater voice. It is this kind of man and this kind of church that the world cannot ignore. For when heaven backs a life, even hell must take notice. When the wind of the Spirit fills the sails of a surrendered soul, no power of darkness can stop the movement. And when money, yes, even money, hears the sound of obedience wrapped in holiness, it cannot help but come, not to exalt the man, not to elevate the name, but to fulfill the purposes of God through a vessel emptied of pride. You ask for the sentence that makes money respond immediately. But do you first ask for the altar where that sentence is born? Are you willing to be reduced, stripped, broken, and remade before that sentence ever comes from your lips? Can you bear the silence of God long enough to be trusted with a sound that shakes the heavens and moves the earth? God is not slow, He is precise. He is not poor, He is perfect. And He will not fund what He does not finish. He will not endorse what He did not begin. You may move ahead without Him. You may gather support, raise funds, launch projects, and the world may call you successful. But heaven does not measure by volume. It measures by obedience. God will not anoint the plans you made in fear, nor bless the efforts born of anxiety. He waits. He watches, He weighs the heart. And to the man, the woman, the church who waits with Him, who will not move until He speaks, who will not speak until He burns, they will find that money becomes a mere tool in the hands of the Master. It flows, it aligns, it submits, because the one who holds it has already submitted. It is not a mystery, really. It is not a formula to learn or a secret to uncover. It is a posture to embrace. Total surrender, clean motives, a life no longer lived for applause or approval, a ministry no longer performed for growth or gain, a heart that says in the quiet hours, I will be yours, whether you send or not. I will serve, whether you provide or not. I will obey, even if I am never seen, never funded, never celebrated. That is where God begins to move. That is where heaven begins to and that is where money listens, not to the man but to the mission, not to the voice but to the echo, not to the dream but to the decree from the throne. You do not need to chase money. You need to chase God. You do not need to convince others. You need to be convinced yourself. You do not need a platform. You need a prayer room, because the man who kneels longest will stand strongest, and the man who has died deepest will be trusted most. Money is not the measure. Obedience is. Provision is not the proof. Purity is. And success is not the signal. Surrender is. If God can find a soul like that, He will place His word in their mouth and His resources in their hands, not to make them famous, but to make Himself known. So say only what eternity can cash, move only where He leads, and live in such a way that when God whispers, "This one I can trust," all of heaven's resources follow, not because you ask for them, but because your life has become the sentence heaven cannot ignore.